going to start on our basket. So the basket needs to start off with the very base of the basket, the very centre of the basket, and you can see here from below, this is the section that we're next going to produce. The section for this basket is just purely and simply done with one colour of weave, but you can produce baskets where the weave is very decoratively done with different types of willow. So we're going to concentrate on the willow that we're going to choose for our basket, and our first section to do, our first thing we need to think about are these strands that run across here and run across this way. They're called stakes. So we're going to select those from our thickest rods that we had to begin with. So I've got 8 rods, I only need 6 out of these 8 rods. If I look carefully, I'll find that some of them are really nice and balanced and the same thickness as the others, some aren't. So if you look at this one, for example, it's slightly thicker and slightly larger than the others, and this one's trying to escape, but this one is slightly thinner than the others. I've got a nice even match set of 6 here, so I'm going to choose these 6, I'm going to discard these 2, save those for another job. So I now want to measure the bottom of my basket, and these need to be slightly larger, about 1 inch on either side. So all I'm going to do is to use the basket sample that I've got. I'm going to take my withies and just lay them on the top, and then I'm going to cut them one at a time, roughly to size. So there I have my 6 rods now ready. I'm not bothering cutting this end, you'll see why in a short while. So the first bit of the basket that we're going to create is the slath on the bottom of the basket, and we've got the 6 rods that we've already cut and pre-prepared, and we're going to look at a tool now called a bodkin. So I've got 3 bodkins here for you to have a look at, and we'll discuss tools in more detail in the tool video, so you can have a look at that, find out a little bit more about those. If you haven't got a bodkin at home, you could find something similar to hand, something with a sharp point. So maybe a brad awl or an awl or a sharpened screwdriver would do you just the same job. What I'm looking for in the bodkin is I'm looking at the width of the bodkin being relative to the width of the willow. So I've got 3 different sizes here, and I really want to choose the middle size of those bodkins that will work perfectly with this willow. So next I want to have a look at the smile of the willow. So you can see on this piece of willow that it's quite happy. We're going to use that smile to our advantage for the bottom of our basket. So looking at the pieces of willow that we have, there's a very slight smile on them, and we can accentuate that smile by just stroking them a little bit more, just to get them a little bit happier. If you have a look at this one, you can just about see that there's a slight doming on it. We use that structurally in our basket. So what we would ideally want is the dome to come on the inside of the basket, so that as the weight is pushed onto there, it's evenly distributed. What we don't want is to put our basket that way round, because it will start to rock. So we're going to use the bodkin that we've selected, and we're going to be mindful of the cut ends of the willow that we had from previous, and we're going to set them into 2 sets of 3. And we're going to try and balance them up by having a cut end, and then we'll turn this one to have a cut end at this side, and we'll have a cut end there. It tries to balance out and even up the basket. Obviously we can't be perfect because there's only a 3, but we try as much as we can. These 3 are going to get pierced through with the bodkin. So we're looking at the very tip of the bodkin, and we're looking at putting that right in the middle of the willow, and my fingers are really up close. I don't want to be piercing through and slipping off. So my fingers are close and holding, and I'm piercing through, and it's just a gentle push till I've pierced through that first section of willow. I'm then going to move that willow slightly up the bodkin. I'm using my body so that I can just gently wiggle it up. What I don't want to do is to pull it too far and to extend this too far down the rod and weaken it. So it's important that this bodkin is balanced with the thickness of the willow. We do the same with the second one. So the first one is fed on, and you don't want to be to one side or to the other, you want to be in the middle. And we'll push down gently again and pull onto the bodkin the second piece of willow. We do the same with the third and final one. That one's been a bit feisty. So we've now got all 3 pieces of willow inserted onto the bodkin, and go very, very gently with the bodkin. You don't want to be working towards you. The bodkin always wants to be away from you, and be mindful of where your fingers are. We're then going to prepare 2 of the other 3. So again, we're going to look at these butt ends, these rough and ragged ends, and we're going to cut a sloping cut on the opposite side. And these get inserted either side of the bodkin, and the slope is just there to help us to push that through. And if you're struggling a little bit, it's because you haven't got enough room, so just push your bodkin in a little bit more. They should go in nice and gently. And again, we're using that smile that's curving away from us. I put the one in on the other side. And I've got a little bit of a knobble on the end of this, so I'm just taking it a little bit steady. I don't know if you can see there's a little bit of a growth. That's going to be out of our way, so I'm not worried about it. So we've got a sort of bodkin sandwich. And we can now take our bodkin out and take the last piece of willow and again cut that slopey cut on it, and that will go the opposite way. So we've got the fat end here, the rough ends are here, and we're going to hopefully balance those up by inserting that in through the centre. And that is the start of the base of our basket. That is the slath. We've got our slath ready for weaving. Our slath is the section that sits on the bottom of the basket, so that will be here and will radiate out all of those arms as we weave. We're going to tie in the slath to begin with, and that's these rods here where you can see that they've gone over 2, 4, 6, 8. That's the bit that we're going to do next. We're going to look at the rods from our pile of 4 foot that we've selected, and even though I've selected thin ones, there's some extra special even thinner ones. So just here I've got the really, really thin ones to work to tie off to begin with. I'll put those down for later. Now you can choose to use with the butt end, which is the thick end, or the tips, which are the thin end. As a beginner, it's an awful lot easier to use the tips. But you'll find as you work that it looks nicer if you do the butt ends. So if we go back to our basket here, you can see that they're much stronger, they're much thicker rods. But for this basket, I suggest we start with the tips because it'll be easier for you. But as you progress, swap that in, see how you find the butts. So we're next going to tie in the slath. So I've taken my 2 thinnest 4 foot rods and I've matched them both in terms of the thickness and also in terms of the length as well. It's really important that one doesn't run out before the other. I'm just going to cut off the end. It's a bit thin and a bit spindly, and I've got these knobbly bits on this particular bit of willow. So I'm just going to cut those off, and that will help me to insert them into the gap that I've got here. So I'm looking at inserting into the gap that I created by my bodkin, and I'm going to put the tip end into one side and the tip end into the other. The tip being the thinner section of the willow, the butt being the fatter. And I've just gently caught those under my fingers. Now this bit will mess you about. It will move, it will jiggle, it will loosen. You just have to fight it for its initial few stages. So these 2 rods come down towards me, and they're always in that position of being down, one on the left, one on the right. And what we're going to do is weave, and we're going to turn as we weave. So I want you to get into the rhythm of this. So we'll do all 8 and you can see how it works. So the left one always works over the top of the right one, never underneath. So left goes towards the right. We make a very positive movement down and then we pull it back again. So in essence, it's gone over 3, behind 3. We're now going to move the whole slath around so it sits back in that initial position of one being on the left, one being on the right. So again, we take the left over 3, behind 3, and we do the movement so it turns back to the position that we started with. I've captured these little bits in, and they're now nicely trapped. So over 3, behind 3, and turn. Over 3, behind 3, and turn. And you can see here, before I pull them back into position, you can see that I've got 1 on each of the sets of rods. Now, although I'm pulling down, the next one sits over the top of the previous rod, so make sure it doesn't come underneath. So over the top, in front of 3, behind 3, do your quarter turn. Over the top, in front of 3, behind 3, quarter turn. Pull back. In front of 3, behind 3, quarter turn, pull back. And you're pretty much there now. That next stitch will take you 2 on each of the sets of rods. So that's your initial tying in. Now you may want to do 3. Have a look, see what works for you, but you need to be moving these a little bit later on, and you don't want to fill this gap in with too much weave. It's just the initial tying to lock it into place. So that's the first bit of tying in the slath. So we've tied in our slath with those initial 4 pairs. What we now need to do is to start radiating these spokes out so that our basket base will look a little bit more like this. So here you can see that the spokes have radiated out and we've got a nice equal, even distance in between them. We're going to work in this section of the basket, and it takes quite a little bit of force to actually get these as tight as you possibly can. It may not be very tight on your first basket, but have a go, see if we can get those gaps closed up. So let's have a look at the weave. So we make sure that we've gone over that first one. What we need to do is to start radiating these spokes out, so we need to kink those spokes to begin with. The left one will kink to the left, the right one will kink to the right, the middle one remains where it is. We need to be very mindful that we've got a split in these rods, and that when we kink them, we need to kink the front and the back of the split. If we make a mess of this, it really is a case of starting all over again. So, you're going to take your thumbnail. Some people like to use a knife. It's entirely up to you. And I'm going to go right into that weave, and I'm going to kink this down. I don't need to kink it down too far because it's going to radiate out into that position. And then I'm going to kink the other one as far down as I can so that those 2 will eventually end up into that position there. I'm going to go round. I ignore the middle one, kink this one down, kink this one up to meet it, ignore the middle one, kink this one down, and I'm just going to work all the way around the base till those will sit into the positions that I want them to. And you really, really want to be as close as you possibly can with this. So make sure that they're nice and kinked, make sure that there's no damage here onto the rods, because you're going to be putting an awful lot of force onto them with the next bit that we're going to be doing. So we've tied our initial pairs onto each set of 3. We're now going to start to radiate these out. We've got these kinked down in perfect position, and we're going to start weaving to bring these into the position of the radiating spokes out. Just be a little bit mindful, it's very easy to miss that last one here and to start weaving a little bit too short. What we're aiming to do is to start moving around these rods next. So it's a very, very distinctive, deliberate 2-part movement. You want this to be as tight as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the left rod again, make sure we've gone over those 3. We're going to deliberately pull down to kink into there to get it as tight as we can. We're then going to open our leg and we're going to pull back down as tight as we can. We've gone back now to having both at the front, one on the left, one on the right. The left one is always going to work over the top of the right one and into that space that the right one is occupying. So in front of one, deliberate pull down, spread the leg, behind one and back again. What it's not is just a sort of flick it under movement. There is a very deliberate pull down, pull back. And you can see that the legs are starting to spread out, the spokes are starting to radiate. And we move around, so we're always weaving in this top space. Take the left, pull down, spread the leg, pull it into the space. It does take quite a bit of effort to get these to pull into the right position. And you might find that they're not really where you want them right from the get-go, but after you've put a couple of rows on, they should be in the right position. Go a little bit steady that you're not sort of closing things up with your finger positions as you're moving round. So over one, pull down, spread your leg, pull back, and you'll see the pattern occurring. Pull down, make sure your fingers don't get in the way too much. And you can see here, if I don't pull down, let me just show you, it's miles away. You really, really want it nice and close. Now, if some of you find it's very difficult to pull this down, there is an alternative way of doing it that gives you almost a third pair of hands. So what I'd like to show you next is just how you can do it underfoot. So the alternative way of doing the base would be underfoot. It does kill your knees and it kills your back, but if you just do that initial 2 rows with it, it does make everything a little bit tighter. So left or right-handed, whichever way you're working, whichever way you're comfy, I'm going to put my boot on top of these rods here and work in front of me. I want to be really mindful that I don't scuff the back of the rods on the floor, so whilst you're being quite powerful and quite forceful, just look after your willow. It's exactly the same movement, but you're using your foot to pull against. So we take the left, we pull back, we separate, we pull again, and I'm pulling against my foot. All of that energy is going through there. Take the left again, pull back, and pull. And you're pedaling really as you go round. So you can set these into position, and you're doing each one that's sort of in front of you almost at 12 o'clock as you work round. This one's been a bit feisty, but because I'm doing it underfoot, I can really get that pull down and that pull back again. And you'll find working underfoot as well will give you that natural curvature that we're wanting in the bottom of the basket. So just another alternative way for you to maybe have a play at doing your base, which might help for those of you that need that extra little bit of oomph to pull things in. And we'll carry on all the way to the end of these rods. So I've got 2 or 3 rows now put onto my weave, and you can see quite clearly that these spokes now are pretty much in the right position that I want them to be in. But I've run out of the rods, so I now need to join some new rods in. So same as before, I'm selecting 2 rods that are of equal weight, so the same thickness, and I'm looking particularly still for the thin ones. I'm also looking for the same length as well with those rods. I don't want one to run out before the other. Now the join is very simple. We join in whatever we've been left with. So if we've been left with the fat end or the butt, we're going to join the fat end or the butt in. What we're not going to do is to join the tip in. So it's a like for like join. So we keep things in the same pattern of weaving. We would join the left one in first and the right one in second. And I always like to join both in at the same time, even though they're different lengths, just so I can see where I've gone. And if at any point while you're weaving you do have a bit of an accident and one of these rods breaks, then it's the same principle, you just join like for like in. So if you were halfway through a rod when it broke, you would join in just half of a rod. So the join is this. We take the left hand one and we pull it back, and it gives us a little hole in which we can insert this one. So you can see that it's following the same line, the same pattern. One sticking out the back, one sticking out the front. and we work that stroke or we work that stitch. Now because it's quite fat, we want to be quite mindful of the fact that we need to do that pull down and that pull back. So that is this rod replaced and a new one in. What we now need to do is to replace this second rod. So it's the same exactly, pull back, take the new butt and shove that in the gap. And you can really nicely, clearly see the join in here now of the two. We take this and we work that stitch again in exactly the same way. Pull back again. We want some tension, we want some tightness on here, so really give it some when you're working round. And there are new rods inserted and they're ready to carry on weaving until we get to the tips. So I'll carry on my weave and check back in with you when I'm on my tips, and I'll show you how to join the tips in. So here you can see that we've now got a number of rods on. All of these spokes are radiating out and they're roughly in the right position for us. We've done a join already with the butts. We're going to do a join with the tips. What we need to be mindful of is also keeping the curvature of that base as we work. And we also want to think about where the joins are going. So we don't want them all to end up in the same place. So here we've got the butts finishing here. We're going to have the tips finishing here. What we don't want to do is to weave the tips to oblivion. There's no real value in this bit that's left, so we want to join in before it runs out. So we're again selecting two rods, the 4-foot rods, equal in terms of the thickness of the rod, and also they're both matched up in terms of the length of the rod. And because we've finished with tips, we're going to join in on the tips. It's exactly the same joint as previous. So we pull back and we push in the first rod and we work that stitch behind and in front. We've finished with that one, so we now join in the next one. And again, pull back, occupy that space, in front and behind. Just have a check-in with these rods that they're actually not sitting on top of each other, but they're sitting side by side. If they're sitting on top, they'll create a bit more of a gap, so we want them side by side. And you'll notice now, because these are nice and thin, we're not necessarily having to do the pull back, pull forward. We can be a bit more relaxed about coming round nice and gently, coming round again. And we carry on weaving in exactly the same way until we end up with the tips of this rod. Now, you might be tempted to cut these bits back. Don't, because you're still messing about with these rods. But if they're really getting in your way and they're really annoying you, just cut them back to about 1 inch, where you've got a bit of distance you can still work with. So they're not in your way, but don't be tempted to cut them all the way back down there. And we're going to carry on weaving in exactly the same way until we get round to the butts. So we're back round to butts again, and we need to join some new butts in. We could join it in exactly the same way that we did before, pulling back and inserting in onto the right. But I'd like to show you a lock joint, just another way of joining in, and it locks the actual joint of the two rods together, something you might want to try. You wouldn't use a lock joint where you've got a very small space to work into. So now is ideal, we're joining the third set of rods in. So instead of pulling back to find that void, we actually work onto the left-hand side of the rod instead. You need to compress these down as you're working, so I'm afraid my fingers will get in the way slightly. But you can see the position. We compress down and we work in front of one, behind one, in exactly the same way we did before. We're then going to insert the next rod in. So this first one is finished with. We're inserting in here for the second rod. And again, we're going to compress down in order to be able to go behind and in front. And that's the lock joint put in. We're going to carry on then now. We're going to weave these back to tips And every joint that we do from now on will be either tip to tip or butt to butt. Have a go at the lock joint if you want, but we're aiming to get this out now to about 8 inches in total. And you want to measure across this way and across that way to check that your basket is even. Everything is now in perfect position. Just don't let it get out of position as you carry on weaving. So I'll check back in with you when I've put a bit more weave on, and we'll see how to tackle the edge of the basket. So we're now at a stage where we've got our base to the required size. What we need to do is to finish off these last 2 rods. We need to finish on the thin tips so that we can actually thread them into the row below. So it's quite difficult for you to see, but what I want to do is to flip this over so you can see it from the other side. So we would be taking this rod first, and we would normally go behind that rod. What we want to do is to alter the angle so that you can see that I'm actually going to sew into the row previously. So I'm going to turn this over, and you can then clearly see that instead of going behind, what I actually want to do is to insert it into this position here where my bodkin is. So I'm just going to take my bodkin out and thread that through. And just pull that through nice and gently to that position. This next one would be going in front of this one and would be going behind this one. So again, I'm going to flip it over for clarity of where I'm going with this rod. So I turn over, and I'm going to put the bodkin in the position I would like it in. Take the bodkin out, now I've given it some room, and I'm going to thread that into there. A little bit difficult to see with all these other rods around, but it's basically both of those have gone and sewn into the row underneath whilst keeping the same sink and the same rhythm of the weave. And that is our base finished, and we're ready now for trimming. So now we're all stitched in, all good, but before we trim we just need some final adjustments. So what I'm going to do is have a look at this and have a squeeze where I feel it might need a little bit more love just to tighten it up. I'm also going to use my knee to accentuate that curve, and I can just give it a little bit of a push into that, and I'm pushing my kneecap into the middle of there, just nice and gently, just to accentuate. I'm also going to look at the position of these, and again, if I need to, adjust everything. What I don't want to do is I don't want to trim and pop any of these out of position. So I'm just going to trim one side, and you can see how to trim and exactly where to trim. So we've got a lot of the butt ends, the fat ends here, and we're looking for the position of those fat ends, and we want them sitting on one of the uprights. So we're going to cut them close on a sloping cut called a slipe cut for it to sit on this actual arm or this spoke coming out. If you cut too high, it's very difficult to then do a little cut. So you want to make sure that your cut is really good and true to begin with. And a little tip is to actually just lift that up so you don't catch the other weavers underneath as you cut. Nice sharp secateurs also. So we're just going to lift and flat trim. Okay. So it sits nice and flush and you see the slipe cut on that rod. What you don't want is a straight cut because that will catch. So we're just going to go round and very quickly. You can do the same with the thin ones as you do the thick. I'm just going to work my way round and trim all of these off. You'll obviously take a little bit more time and a bit more care than I will. I'm fairly used to trimming, so I can trim at speed. So I've trimmed all of that side nice and neatly. I don't need to show you how to trim the other side. I'm sure you're very, very competent and can trim that side yourself. Once we've trimmed both sides, we need to look at trimming these outside spokes, and that's our next job. So all trimmed up, front and back, and we're ready for trimming these spokes now. We need to trim the spokes as close as we can. Some people like to trim a few and then insert the rods for the next section in as they work. I like to trim them all off at once. We need to be quite confident about our trimming. Again, sharp secateurs are key. And this time we're not on a sloping cut, we're on a straight cut. What you need to do is to just have a little bit of a pull so that when you cut back that, it's as far back as it can be. But be very mindful that you don't want to cut these rods at the same time. I always hold on to these rods so they don't fly across the room, but obviously you want to see what I'm up to. So we're going to cut these, and we're going to cut these as tight as we can. I'm going to cut one a little bit too long because I want to show you a little bit later on what happens when it's not quite right. And I'm going to work around all of those, do every one until we've got a nice clean basket ready for the next stage. It's always very satisfying doing this because it means that the basket's, starting to look like a proper basket. So that's us ready. All of these are cut perfectly. There's a deliberate cut too long, so I can show you a little bit later how we can escape from I've done it wrong. And we're next up to putting the stakes in at the side.